On a stormy afternoon in June, President Joe Biden arrived in Atlanta for a debate that would ultimately unravel his bid for re-election.
That night, Vice President Kamala Harris went on TV to defend the president.
This election and who is the president of the United States has to be about substance. And the contrast is clear. Look at what happened during the course of the debate. Donald Trump lied over and over and over again, as he is wont to do.
This week, the campaign arrived back in Atlanta to a race that has been transformed.
The path to the White House runs right through this state.
Harris is now a newly minted presidential candidate looking to turn the burst of energy from a fresh ticket into a force of volunteers and donors that can sustain her campaign through November.
So the momentum in this race is shifting. And there are signs that Donald Trump is feeling it.
On today's episode, how Atlanta bookended 33 days that changed the 2024 election. I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
All right, Rahul, before we get into it, I think we've got to just take a second and note the remarkable nature of this dizzying past month, which really was set in motion in Atlanta and then capped off by Harris's rally this week again in Atlanta.
You know, in last week's podcast episode, I actually used the word historic, and then said it was legitimately historic, Sam, because the events of the past month, they're going to be in history books and talked about for generations of what happened. And I didn't realize it was 33 days between the CNN debate in Midtown and this week's Harris rally in downtown Atlanta. It really has been just a blur, Sam.
So I was on a pre-planned vacation for 2 weeks of this, as you know, Rahul. And granted, I was in a swing county, Grand Traverse County in northern Michigan. And I snapped a picture on a walk in Traverse City of a Biden-Harris sign where the owner had cut off the Biden part and taped it over the top. So it just read Harris. And I think it was kind of this perfect encapsulation of these fast-moving last few weeks where voters and journalists have been just really trying to keep up. And real quick, as you talk about the historic nature of this period of time, I want to read my lead from the story I wrote the night of that debate in June, because I think it ended up being quite prescient. Quote, again and again, Atlanta has been the backdrop for some of this decade's most pivotal moments in American politics. Thursday night's presidential debate may be another.
So let's pick up with Air Force Two landing in Atlanta on Tuesday. You were in what's called the press pool with the vice president. First, what does that even mean? And then and tell our audience, what is that like?
So Air Force Two is the name for any official jet carrying the vice president. Reporters in the local pool wait on the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson, where private jets come in, and you basically stay with the principal throughout their visit, following them wherever they go in the motorcade. So you're waiting on the tarmac, and then you hear the thunder of the jet landing with the United States of America scrawled across the side of the plane. You're hustled out onto the tarmac and under the wing of the plane. And that's where the vice president is greeted by dignitaries, in this case, Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens. And then the vice president made a beeline for the reporters to address some developments in the Middle East.
I want to address what's happened over the last few hours in terms of the Middle East.
Reporters then shouted questions. Harris did not answer. We are then hustled into vans in the motorcade, which basically speed down Atlanta's freeways with motorcycles, ambulances, black SUVs. You're running through red lights, traveling on empty freeways, which in Atlanta, of course, is a really surreal experience given all the bumper-to-bumper traffic that we know so well. You don't know where you're going, and then you pull up at the first stop, which ended up being Pascal's Restaurant. This is an Atlanta institution founded in 1947. It was a haunt for civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. It's famous for its peach cobbler and fried chicken. There were just a few people in the restaurant in this pre-dinner hour, but the people who were there were clearly genuinely shocked to see the vice president showing up.
Thank you all for the warm welcome. All right, now.
Yes, ma'am.
Nice
Yes,
to
ma'am.
meet you. Thank
Yes,
you.
ma'am. Thank you. Good.
Then, after a couple of minutes, you're hustled back into the vans. The motorcade takes off again and brings us to the Georgia State Convocation Center, and that is where this rally got underway. And Rahul, even if it's brief, it is neat to be able to get close to the candidate like this. You know, this happens all the time where you're getting FaceTime in a Senate race, a gubernatorial race, even presidential candidates during the primary. You know, I remember being within arm's length of Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg back in Iowa. But at this point in the campaign, when you're covering big rallies, it's really pretty rare. And so it gives you a little bit of a different lens on the campaign and on the candidate.
And Sam, while you were zipping down an empty downtown connector, I was actually already at the Georgia State University Convocation Center where the rally was held. You know, we were going through, of course, a lot of extra security as we were setting up. And I was also talking to voters in line. Some of my favorite people to talk to are the ones who are first in line. And this time, some of these people had been there 6-7 hours before the doors even opened. And the main thing I was asking was, what changed with Harris being at the top of the Democratic ticket instead of Biden? This is Javoris Brown of Atlanta.
We needed an injection of youthful energy, and not just from the candidate, from the voters. And the voters seem to be a little bit unenthused with Joe Biden, albeit a great job, but the messaging, I think he had trouble with messaging more than it was the policies, because the policies they affect the people more than the person. So it wasn't the policies, it was the person, and they needed a change at the top of the ticket to galvanize the Democratic Party and also to bring out new, younger voters.
And Rahul, I've got to say, it was clear to me that this campaign has really been transformed from Joe Biden's into Kamala Harris's, not just in name, but in tone, in approach, in energy. And Harris, in a way, wielded Atlanta's culture to put that metamorphosis on full display. The vice president quoted Georgia native rapper Quavo, who helped found the hip-hop group Migos, as she criticized former President Donald Trump for nixing a bipartisan immigration bill in Congress.
Or as my friend Quavo would say, he does not walk it like he talks it.
And as a Hotties for Harris sign unfurled in the stands, Megan Thee Stallion told the crowd.
And if you want to keep loving your body, you know who to vote for.
That's a reference there to her song Body and the rollback of abortion rights since Roe v. Wade fell. Harris even talked about the civil rights generation passing the baton, something she said Atlantans know very well, which I also heard as a reference to the generational change happening at the top of the ticket. And Rahul, Harris did not mention Joe Biden's name at all in her stump speech. So the question now for me, is this momentum sustainable, and is this reset enough to energize the young voters who were maybe on the fence about voting at all in this election?
And Sam, I want to take a moment to talk more about the issues the vice president addressed, especially issues that Republicans believe that they can win votes on, especially with swing voters. One of those issues she addressed, inflation.
But while inflation is down and wages are up, prices are still too high. You know it and I know it. And when we win this election, here's what we're going to do about it. On day one, I will take on price gouging and bring down costs.
Now, she specifically mentioned fees by banks and other companies, corporate landlords in housing, and prescription drug prices. It's going to be interesting to see more details on those proposals. And as you mentioned, immigration also came up, specifically U.S.-Mexico border policy. Harris pointed out that a bipartisan deal earlier this year failed after former President Trump urged Republican lawmakers to oppose it.
As president, I will bring back the border security bill that Donald Trump killed, and I will sign it into law and show Donald Trump what real leadership looks like.
Sam, since Vice President Harris became the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee, we have seen Republicans attack her over and over on the border, on inflation, that what's happened over the past few years is owned by her. To bring this all full circle, this whole shakeup started with what happened at the CNN debate here in Atlanta. And at the rally on Tuesday, Harris directly challenged Trump to debate her.
Yeah, that's right. There is a debate scheduled for September 10th. That was scheduled back when Biden was still the Democratic standard bearer. But now that Harris has replaced Biden, Trump has seemed to be backing away from that commitment. Let's listen to Harris on Tuesday.
I do hope you'll reconsider to meet me on the debate stage. Because as the saying goes, if you've got something to say it to my face.
You know, Sam, about 50 million people watched that first Biden-Trump debate in June. The record is 85 million for the first Hillary Clinton-Trump debate in 2016. It's going to be interesting to see if this debate happens, how many people watch and who watches if the debate demographic turns younger.
And, you know, as we have realized in the last month, September 10th is more than a month away, and a heck of a lot can happen in 4 weeks. So there was a lot to get to before we even make it to that potential debate in September. Let's take a break here. This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics Podcast.
Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics Podcast. So, Sam, I want you to dig into a question that you've been exploring this week. After President Biden's poor debate performance, many Democrats had become pretty fatalistic about their chances in capturing Georgia this year. Does the rise of Vice President Harris to the top of the ticket shake up that map at all?
Well, the Biden campaign had signaled they were prioritizing more winnable blue wall states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The emerging Sunbelt battlegrounds like Georgia looked like more of a stretch. But since this shakeup, Emory professor Andra Gillespie says the campaign may be able to shift the terrain.
She has the ingredients to make the state more competitive than it was a month ago.
But Gillespie says
you can't just assume that because she's a woman of color, because she is of Black and Asian ancestry, that all of a sudden people are going to turn out and vote for her. She's got to ask for their vote.
Now, Harris Battleground States Director Dan Cannonen kind of brushed off questions about a shifting map.
The vice president is strong in both the blue wall and in the Sun Belt, and we are running hard in both.
Still, Trump leads Harris in most swing state polls, including in Georgia, though his edge seems to be narrowing, and Bloomberg had a poll this week showing the race in Georgia essentially tied.
Now, Sam, on the ground, one of the signs that I saw of a renewed Democratic optimism and energy in Georgia, it was over the weekend when I covered Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear campaigning for Harris in the Republican stronghold of Forsyth County.
And I'm the proud Democratic governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. This is not my first speech on the back of a pickup truck.
By the way, that pickup truck, a four-door Dodge Ram 1500 with a Hemi engine in it, much nicer than my first truck, which was a 1985 Ford F-150, but I digress.
Rahul, I want to know whose truck that was, because remember, Senator Raphael Warnock's Beagle turned out not to be his Beagle in those campaign ads. So I want to know, this is probably not Andy Beshear's pickup truck. Whose is it? Who loaned it?
I actually don't know. That's a good question. I actually know who to ask. So I will go get that answer for you. Look, a couple of reasons I wanted to go to this event, is his name early on was seriously being mentioned as a running mate for Vice President Harris. He's a Democratic governor. He calls himself pro-union, pro-choice, pro-public education, pro-diversity in a Republican state, something he referenced in his speech in front of a couple hundred supporters.
People ask me, and I'm sure they ask you too, how do you do it? How do you win? We win by staying true to our values of compassion, of empathy, of doing right by our neighbors. We won by bringing everyone together, Democrats, Republicans, independents from all over Kentucky. We win by caring and fighting for every single vote in every single county. Every single one of you matters. Are you willing to do the work to turn out that vote?
Okay, so let me jump in here. We've been talking about Democrats needing to muster this coalition of voters of color and independent-minded voters who helped deliver Georgia for the Democrats in 2020. Well, as you know, I've spent the last few years returning again and again to one suburban community north of Atlanta, Alpharetta, to track how some of these independent-minded so-called swing voters are feeling. And after all of the tumult of the last couple of weeks, I caught back up with two voters over text this week. Voter Deanna McKay cast her vote for Trump in 2016 and Biden in 2020. She was already struggling to decide between the two when Biden bombed during that June debate. And after that, McKay decided she would likely sit out the presidential election entirely. Well, now McKay says she is, quote, still very stuck, but might vote for Harris now. Let me tell you about another voter I've kept in touch with, Carrie Webster. She has also been undecided and says the shakeup has actually made her decision even more fraught. Webster told me that Harris certainly is more likable than Trump, but she still thinks about how much better the economy felt under the Trump presidency and how much lower inflation was then, which she says are her biggest concerns personally.
So, Sam, after all of that, nothing slows down here. Let's look ahead to this weekend. Former President Trump and his running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, will campaign in Atlanta at the very same venue that Harris packed earlier this week.
Yeah, so Rahul, how are Republicans thinking about the state of the race right now? And what will you be watching for in this weekend rally?
So, Sam, I caught up with Republican Georgia Congressman Rich McCormick. He believes that this is just a short-term bump for Vice President Harris.
There's much more excitement than there was for Biden, but I think that the Republicans will still handle business. You saw Governor Kemp win by 7%, I believe. And I think that Kamala is still underwater in the issues that matter most to Georgians, whether it be First Amendment, Second Amendment, border, crime, debt, energy, education.
Now, McCormick represents the 6th congressional district, but is now running for the new 7th congressional district. Remember, we had another round of redistricting in Georgia. His new district includes North Fulton, Forsyth County, and other reliably Republican areas. But as you just mentioned, and as you have reported, a number of swing voters and disaffected Republicans live in those northern suburbs of Atlanta. So I asked him, what does he believe is going on in the district?
I think people are as motivated as they've ever been to show up, to turn out the base. And I think President Trump's always been good at turning out the base. The question is about those moderates or those crossover people, those people who are easily offended. I think they've kind of gotten over that what I would call the Trump derangement syndrome, where they think, well, I just don't like his personality, therefore I'm not going to vote for him. Now they're seeing what could really become if they don't vote for the right policies.
As for Saturday's rally with Trump and Vance, first, I'm wanting to watch Vance himself. Never seen him before. Second, I'm watching for specific messaging from the former president about Georgia.
Before we go, I want to share a conversation I've been having with a voter I met a few weeks ago at a Juneteenth celebration with Harris in Atlanta.
So tell me more about that.
So at this Juneteenth barbecue, I met voter Val Acree, and Acree admitted that she was a little nervous about the 2024 campaign, even though she was fired up about the ticket. She said she worried about disinformation and disengagement. So when this news of President Biden stepping down from running for the presidency happened, Acree was one of the first voters that I thought of and was itching to know how she was feeling about this moment. So this week we hopped on a Zoom call and I asked her about when she heard the news. She says she was away at her and her wife's camper home for the weekend when someone texted her.
I was like, oh my God, no. What does this mean?
Okay, so that was the initial reaction, but quickly the party coalesced around Vice President Kamala Harris, and now Acree says,
Gosh, I am re-energized, I'm recharged, and I'm more optimistic than ever about Kamala Harris leading our country.
And Acri feels Democrats have a better shot at winning Georgia than they did just a month ago. Acri is hoping Harris can activate women in what she calls the movable middle around reproductive rights, and believes the vice president can maybe be a more effective messenger on abortion than Biden. Even though Acri is feeling recharged, though, by this new presumptive nominee, she does still have some nerves.
I believe with my whole heart that she will do an outstanding job. But after Hillary's unexpected defeat in 2016, I did have some anxiety about America's readiness to elect a woman, particularly a woman of color.
Now that Harris is the presumptive nominee, I asked Acri if she's sleeping any better, though.
I am not getting any sleep, not at all.
So I asked her why, and Acri told me her lack of sleep now, though, is driven less by anxiety about the ticket and more by her hunger to consume every news update about this race. Acri told me she wants to make sure she's as informed as she can be when she talks to friends and neighbors about getting engaged with the election. And Rahul, when Harris took the stage in Atlanta this week, Acri was in the audience cheering her on. And just to put a coda on this story, we emailed the morning after the rally, and Acri told me she was front and center at the rally, and she's even more excited, inspired, and motivated than she was before.
Sam, if she's looking to consume every news update about this race, there's going to be a lot going on over the next week. As we mentioned, former President Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, they're going to be making their way to Atlanta on Saturday for a rally. At some point, we're going to get an announcement from Vice President Harris on who her running mate is, and then Harris and her running mate are going to make their way to Savannah next Friday afternoon.
That's it for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. You can get more Georgia politics at wabe.org/election2024.
Plugged In is a production of the WABE Politics Desk. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick. If you appreciate the reporting you hear on this podcast, subscribe and leave us a review.
Talk to you next week.